sheriff ultimately, if there's something being accused of one of his deputies, ultimately he needs to be able to do the investigation process that he does. But as a complainant, I now have the comfort of knowing that somebody else knows about it, right? So it's not just going to necessarily get shuffled under the rug. And even though he's still doing his process, there's another set of hands that knows that ultimately if there's something is being, reviewed. And I really think it is just about creating that trust and comfortability for people to express. And then I'll let Dave talk and Claire talk, because you represent more of the community.
Dave?
Yeah, I want to back up what Tistria just said. Just speaking from my own experience in another part of the state where I got no response to complaints from going through the police department myself, it would have been nice to know that there was a board that would also see it, so that if I was getting no response from the police department itself, I could have approached that board and said, what's the result? So I know it may seem like not a very powerful or not a very, almost like a pass through, and I understand that. But as Tistria said, it's someone else knows about it. You're not this lonely complainant just sending it to the police department or the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department, I'm sure, is really, really responsive and would act on it in a better way than my experience in New York City showed how that department was doing it. But again, it does give just a board of civilians, really, that might make people feel more comfortable. So I think it's worth it just for that. And I think Ms. Cousin may have said that at an earlier meeting as well.
Supervisor Cousin or Supervisor Mussman, do you have anything to add?
My experience in this community is a lot of people are not going to tell the sheriff directly because they fear retribution. I think that's very real. So if we hand things over directly and their name is on it, that may be an issue that will harm the little kind of opportunity that people have in getting their complaint actually discussed. Many years ago, I was involved with a mother came to me and said that an inmate had been sexually abused at the jail, and there was no other recourse except coming to a citizen in the community and asking for help. And I think that is where, we have to be careful with how this is handled, because otherwise people are just going to ignore this panel. That's Hudson. I don't know about other parts of the community. I just know how it works here. That families, people are targeted, and because of who they are or who their parents are, or there's a whole host of reasons why people don't want to step forward and say who they are when they want to issue a complaint. So they do want it to some degree to be anonymous, I believe. And if it's shared with the sheriff, then people say, well, why bother? So I think that's the battle.
So Elena, is there any, I understand that, the sheriff has his own process, and we can say either or. They can go right to the sheriff, they can go right to the panel, or they can do both. Two things. One, if they went just to the panel and we didn't share it with the sheriff, the panel has no jurisdiction. They can't investigate. So, if we advertise, hey, you're welcome to submit it to the panel and we won't pass it along to the sheriff, but nothing's going to come of it other than, duly noted ticker in the tick box. But is there anything saying that if this panel were to send it to the sheriff, that the complainant's information could stay anonymous, that what happened and who supposedly did something, that probably doesn't leave the sheriff able to actually properly investigate it if there's no name attached, right?
So I first of all, I see the sheriff has his hand raised, and if it would be okay, let me defer to the sheriff, and then I'll respond after the sheriff's had an opportunity to speak, because I think that's only fair since this is department.
Thanks.
Office.
Thank you, Lena. The anonymous reporting, Tristy, I think you hit the nail right on the head. There's really not much we can do if we have no one to interview. First of all, we have to have a valid complaint. We have to have a complainant, especially if it's of a criminal nature. If we don't have a complainant, we don't have a victim, we don't have a crime. So we need to have some availability of some information, And then all these reports potentially could be seen as discovery and turned over in a legal battle as well. And hopefully, I don't perceive any reason why we would have anything like that happen, but it could. Anything could happen at any time. But I'm expecting most of these are going to be complaints based on interactions on traffic stops or, street level encounters. But without some type of complaint, we can't really follow up on it. So I can't really address the union and the member based on a report that I have no real basis to.
So can I say one thing, Sheriff? And I think you would agree with me on this. And I know you're now at starting month 11. Based on just my interactions with lots of departments, and it goes to what Supervisor Mussman said, if you have a serious complaint come in, such as somebody were to come to you and say an inmate was raped, that's a very serious allegation. The person that started it, you may be able to start your investigation without telling all the correction officers, we got a complaint from individual X. You're going to do your investigation. I think the one piece that you probably could agree to, and not to put words in your mouth, is that when there is a complaint, particularly in the office, we don't necessarily disclose to the person who may be the target of the investigation the genesis of where that initial complaint came, or the information, because obviously that is important when the sheriff is investigating. Would you agree with that, Sheriff?
Yes, absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that, Elena. I mean, we're not going to tell them, who our witnesses are or who our complainants are. I mean, it just as we wouldn't when it comes down to investigating a crime if it wasn't involving a police officer. But in the case that you're talking about, we also have that goes beyond the scope of what we're talking.
I mean, I think maybe I don't know I'm going to defer to all of you. You're highly intelligent individuals who made it on this committee and are elected officials, so I can help you navigate what you want to do. But what I would say is, there are probably reasonable steps that could be taken to insulate their identity from global knowledge and maybe, to the community, so they don't have the fears that Supervisor Mussman and Mr. Hall and, Mr. Graziano has indicated so far. Perhaps what we do in a sexual harassment investigation and have done for years, is that the policies never say absolute confidentiality, that they say we'll take all reasonable steps to ensure confidentiality to the extent applicable. Obviously, when somebody I use that as an example, somebody complains about sexual harassment, you have to investigate it. So when you start to ask questions, people are going to wonder, but you try to protect the person complaining the very best you can. And I think that may be the only thing that you can offer, is that you'll attempt to maintain confidentiality to the extent applicable while still ensuring that things are investigated. I think you're threading a needle, and I apologize.
I think, HR is going to need to be a part of this, conversation as well, because if there's a sexual harassment complaint or any type of internal harassment complaint between employees, human resources is going to be involved in that. And, cops hate nothing more than bad cops. So it's not that we're fearful of getting this information and following up on this information and trying to address it and attack it at the root. But we also have to protect the integrity of the office, where, some people are just, let's face it, some people just may not like an officer based on an interaction they may have. Get valid complaints, and we're going to get invalid complaints. Any complaint that comes to this office will follow in a routine manner, uniform manner, and that we get to the root of the problem.
So we all agree that this should be able to be handed off to anybody in the committee, correct? So we can drill some of these things down. We also agree that there should be a chair of the committee, correct? I don't see anybody that disagrees with that. I guess I want to play devil's advocate here. Why are we opening this as this pass through? I think it's imperative that we know who's giving, imperative of who the complaint is against. So we need to know that it's Officer X and Mrs. Smith gave the complaint. And that could be the crux of what the committee can follow up on, and just to say, you know, Mrs. X put a complaint in about Officer Y, you know, was it handled or wasn't it handled? So I guess my question is why would this committee open it? And I'm not against that, but I need to understand why they would open it. Why would they open it and even look through it, especially if that opens up this committee and or these agencies to, you know, what if it is sexual harassment? What if it is something that has to go to HR? So knowing that somebody made the complaint, we know that person, who that person is, and we know that it was against Officer Y, which now goes to the sheriff's department. What is the reasoning for that group to open it if they have no power other than to read and discuss what's going on with this case? I'm not saying I'm against it. I just don't understand what the reasoning would be behind that, which then opens up a lot of terms for that group. So I'd like to understand why we would even do that.
So I think some of the things like Dave was talking about, the purpose of why the community's asking for this committee would be a moot point if we just took it and then passed it along to the sheriff. So if there's another, you know, group that knows that this complaint has come in, or again, has tracked, wow, there's 20 complaints about this same type of behavior, maybe we need more training. None of what you're going to get out of this committee that we've talked about thus far would be attained if they just took an unopened envelope and passed it along. And they're not going to know Officer X, Officer Y, this, because without opening the envelope, you have zero idea what's in there. And
I'm saying we would make sure that the committee does know who the person against.
How
so that
would
this
they do
group
that
would
without
then,
opening it?
well, we would have to ask that individual, or we would have to know that for this to be submitted to this group, that group has to know who the officer is, or if it's an attorney, and who the person is submitting it. Then we could say that we've had 7 complaints against Officer whoever. At least the committee would then have that information. That's what I'm saying.
So are you almost saying they'd submit 2 things? They'd submit like a summary letter that is who it's against, what the nature of the complaint is, and this, and then the sealed envelope that's the details of the complaint?
It could, or they could just say, "This, I have a complaint. It's against Officer so-and-so, and my name is so-and-so," and there's a form they take down. And again, I'm not saying that's the right route, but it's a possible route is what I'm saying. Then we would know that we've had 7 complaints against 1 deputy. And then the committee could say, hey, you know, back to Europe, we've had 6 sexual harassment cases against this officer. We wouldn't know that, but we would know that we have 6 complaints against an officer. Just another thought, you know, as opposed to opening up a letter and then getting into all of these other things. Yeah. Claire, you have your hand raised?
I was just going to say I agree with that point about having like a summary or like a cover of the issue and then asking them to take the next step, because I think also what you may find is the folks who have an unwillingness to even take that step, then we can dig deeper into what the issues are. That's more of an advocacy role that I think that the board could play at some point. But I think if they're willing to give the names of the officers and go to the next step, then we can sort of see which communities or which folks are having a hard time getting there. If they're asked that information and that seems too private, or they're worried about the process, I think we can sort of hammer out kinks by starting there. I think that, you know, identifying the officers and then asking them to go into more detail. In other areas, I've seen that work well.
So it could almost be like the complaint form that comes into this committee is a real kind of superficial summary complaint form. You know, I think it should have the nature of it, not the details, but the nature of it. You know, nature of it, who it's against, and then maybe this committee doesn't even get the sealed envelope. Maybe this committee takes in the summary form and says, this complaint really needs to go to the sheriff's office. We're happy to hand it in for you, or you can submit it directly to the sheriff. Let me know what you're the most comfortable with. And if it comes through the committee, it really is just a passover. And that does get the data. I think that the nature of the complaint's important, because that data piece, again, if we're seeing, maybe it's not even against one officer, maybe there's 10 different complaints, 10 different officers, but the nature of the complaint for every single one is sexual harassment, right? Then there's a very clear, wow, I think there's a need for some training in this area.
But this form could have boxes. It could say harassment. It could say
Yep.
sexual harassment. It could say whatever,
Right.
racism. It could have these generic boxes.
Yep.
And then we would have, so it's not just a pass-through. It's more than just a pass-through. But then we're not getting involved with opening up the specific complaint, which would be in the hands of the sheriff. So I don't think it's just a pass-through. I don't think that's a good way to characterize this. Dave?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, and it was something that was kind of bothering me. Is if it's just a pass through, it's not that effective because, as Tistria said, for a little bit of gathering of data, but at the same time, it's really sensitive stuff that random people on a citizens review panel, as confidential as things are meant to be, it may be best for them not to see the actual details, but just the nature of it. So I think that's a really potent compromise, perhaps.
I also think that it helps the committee to say that Dave Hall has put in 10 complaints, because we're going to know that. Sorry, Dave, I'm not picking on you. But I mean,
only put in one.
Equally as important as to know if it's a certain officer all the time.
Yeah.
Well, it's also important to know if it's a certain person all the time.
Yeah.
And maybe then that person is sort of connected to two people that are always filing complaints because they just don't like the sheriff or whatever.
Right.
So I do think that committee can do more than be a pass-through. I think there's good information to start there. And I do think that, this committee could be revisited to say, well, this is really working, but I think it would be more helpful if we did that.
Sheriff, how many complaints have you gotten or has the office received in the last year or 2 years? Is there any give us an idea of what's happening?
Linda, I have to research that. I mean, the complaints in regard to someone not following up in a timely manner would be different than getting a complaint for someone acting inappropriately. I can't think of one complaint that we received that a deputy acted in an inappropriate manner in the time that I've been seated as sheriff. We do get some complaints about people not happy about the timeliness of follow-ups. But again, we're working with staffing issues and we try to address each call equally. So I did with some numbers.
Are they actually written down somewhere?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Are they telephone calls or are these actual written documents?
It's a combination. We have a online reporting method. We have a tip line. We also get phone calls in through our central dispatch that goes to a sergeant. Depending on the nature of the call, it could be something as a verbal counseling. It could be something as a training issue. It varies.
So would it be helpful if we put together an outline and go ahead? I'm sorry, Linda.
I would like to include the confidentiality part of this as one of the things that guarantees something of a bit of teeth. Otherwise, I don't know. Or we're just a data collecting group of people, but I think the confidential angle would be more opportunity for people to feel that they have another way of getting their voice heard.
Well, I think right on this form, if it's going to be a form, that we have something in there that states that, that this will be handled in such a confidential way, But I think that's an important part of this. I think if Tistria, if you want to maybe even with Elena, we put together an outline that we could circulate with this committee before the next meeting. So maybe we could have it kind of drilled down so we can conclude this next month with all of that in there. At least I think we've gotten good information out of this meeting, and we could put something together so that everybody could look at it.
And I almost think too, Linda, to address your concerns, confidentiality, I almost think there's nothing requiring that next step. So if I just want to put the summary into this committee and I'm like, I am not comfortable putting in the actual complaint to the sheriff's office. I just want it to be noted right? That whatever, then the committee can work with them to encourage. But, you know, I've called before for a certain thing and been like, hey, will this be confidential? And they're like, it could be, but if it ends up in court, then no, you're going to be called to testify. And they give me the choice to then, and I've told them what the nature of the complaint is, and they've then said, I've said, okay, never mind. And they're not like, nope, now you've told us what's happened. You have to move forward to that next step of an official complaint. So it could also just be, there could be some people that are like, I don't want to put a complaint into the sheriff's office. I don't want to take that next step. I just want something on record with my summary, and I'm going to leave it at that. And I don't know that we have to require them. You know, if we say the next step is not necessarily confidential, if there's the sheriff's office does the investigation, if there's something there and there's criminal charges or whatever, then, you know, you may be asked to testify or to, so I don't know that it's required that they have to then take that next step.
All I'm going to say is this, and this is the lawyer and liability purposes for all of you who are elected officials. If you knew or should have known of what you believe to be criminal activity or a pattern of discrimination and harassment towards your citizens and you didn't do anything, you have all exposed yourself and the county to liability. So we need to think through each piece. I completely understand where Supervisor Mussman and Mr. Hall, Mr. Graziano, and Supervisor Cousins are with regard to providing some confidentiality. But once you become aware of some issue, and if it's a significant issue, we're not talking about they were rude to me. I'm not talking about that. That putting on record, I get that, Supervisor Hoagland. I'm worried about if somebody says something really significant happened to them, once you knew or should have known, you've got a legal obligation to investigate. And I know that the sheriff agrees with me in that regard.
So Elena, could you, me, and Rob get together outside of this meeting and do a Zoom, maybe give ourselves an hour and like he said, come up with some structural ideas, or maybe there's this option, that option, and that way the committee coming into the next meeting can really dive into like, okay, we like this option, we like that option.
He has asked me to do it. It's my pleasure.
It's very hard to have people complain and sort of just dip their toe in it. People have to be comfortable enough to come to this group. But if you're going to make a formal complaint, it's somebody's life. Whether it's the officer or theirs, they have to, unfortunately, than we do in our towns with complaints. Do you take anonymous complaints on violations? You need a name. You need. I mean, it has to be that way. Otherwise, you're going to get all these nefarious complaints. I'm sorry, but we just have to make sure that people feel comfortable and confident that this committee is going to do the right thing and they're going to keep it to themselves. What happens from there, I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. Claire?
I was going to say, then I think that we also, when we have time, need to digest what it is that we're going to do differently than most reporting platforms that exist to make people feel comfortable with this process over other processes. So if we have to, from the next step of the summary, if we need them to proceed, then we have to make sure, which is going back to what I was saying before, that folks that wouldn't necessarily take that next step understand the support that could come from this committee also through the process. That it's not just you make a summary, we pass it on to the department, now you have a complaint, and that department still handles the complaint, and we're sort of hands off after that. Because that's what it sounds like just from this conversation. And if that's the case, then this has no point to me as a citizens review board. If we're not supporting them through the entire process, then what's the point?
Well, the issue with that, Claire, is we can support them all you want, but the reality of it is it's up to the sheriff at that point, once he has it, to want to have some sort of collaborative discussion or feed information back and forth. We have no ability to force the sheriff's department once it's in his hands or her hands.
We don't, but I think that we should try to clearly define as much as we can without forcing them to be transparent and continue those conversations in a way that we can communicate it to the community.
She broke up. I couldn't hear her.
You're breaking up. Sheriff?
But
I think
You're breaking up.
had her hand. I think Linda had her hand up first. Go ahead, Linda.
You know, I guess, speaking to Elena's point, I think that supervisors should not be on a board that's called the Citizens Review. to address the very issue that you brought up. I mean, I think this is an error to have people like myself, who is an elected official, who's part of blah, 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 you know, it's, I think it isn't a citizens review board then. So I would opt to have actually citizens be on this board and get rid of people who are elected. As much as I would like to be involved, I think that's a huge conflict right there. So, thanks, Elena.
Sheriff?
Yeah, I just want to make a couple points. You know, I think that, you know, the next meeting that we have, I would like to see all the department heads from the law enforcement agencies that are going to be affected by this be here. And I'd like to see that because, you know, some of these complaints that we may get, and I'm not, you know, I hate to recuse myself from talking as a sheriff right now, but just talking as a law enforcement professional, may not want to go to the agency that's involved. You get a complaint about the chief of a local PD, or you get a complaint about the sheriff. You may not want to send it to that office. So I think we need to have some other agencies represented here as well. And the other point is, you know, based on the Professional Police Act, some of these, most of these complaints are going to have to go into someone's jacket and follow him throughout his career. And it's going to affect his ability to be hired by another agency, even if these allegations are proved to be false. It's still going to show that he's gotten, you know, how many complaints may have come in through this Citizens Review Board and then turned over to an agency. So what is the recourse for an agency if we find these complaints to be false? Is there filing a false statement? Is this, you know, filing a false government document? I mean, these are some things that, you know, I'm going to pursue as a, you know, head of an agency to make sure that I can protect my officers from false allegations as well.
And maybe, I don't know how it works now with the complaint forms, but maybe if that's, you know, the outcome, which I think it should, right? Like if I come in and I say the sheriff did this to me and I'm lying, right? I should be held accountable for lying. So maybe right on the complaint form, it has some wording that I believe, because I've signed things on the town's behalf before with vandalism and things. And it says, you know, filing a false statement is a crime. And, you know, so there should be a wording on the document, the same as there is on other law enforcement documents, that lets people know, like, if you're signing that this is true and it's not true, you're going to be held accountable for that.
There's a
You
lot
also
to
want to be
discuss.
careful. We can talk about this, but I would say you want to also be careful that you don't scare anybody who has a legitimate claim, because sometimes that can be very frightening to them, that they're afraid that if it doesn't all shake out, that they're going to be criminally charged. And so that's I'm just saying, having seen those in sexual harassment complaints, that can be very frightening for somebody. I'm sorry, Supervisor Cousins, I didn't mean to speak over you.
That's okay. I was saying I agree with you, and I also think that, like, if people are already fearing retaliation and they put in a complaint that isn't false but isn't proven, then they have to worry about being, you know, pushed back against. That's what retaliation is. That's what people are afraid of to begin with.
And I agree with the supervisor. You know, any statement we take, there's a clause in the bottom that says false statements made here within or punishable by a Class A misdemeanor, Section 21045 New York State Penal Law. You know, it's a false statement. So I don't think that's asking anyone to do anything or making anyone feel uncomfortable. It's just letting them know that, you know, if in fact these allegations are not credible and not true and accurate in the face, that there's consequences. I'm not saying that should be the language that's used. That's just the language we use on any statements that we give. So, I mean, I want to see if there's something that's done wrong by an officer or a deputy through our office, we want to know about it. By no way, shape, or form am I asking not to have that knowledge. But I also want to be able to protect the officers from false statements and false allegations.
And I think there's a real difference between it wasn't proven, right? So if I complain about sexual harassment and it wasn't proven or it wasn't founded, that's very different than through the investigation it comes out that I just hate that guy and I just straight up made a lie because I wanted him to get in trouble, right? So like that statement for me isn't
I
like, hey,
understand that, but let's use a different example than sexual harassment. Let's use racism, because to some people it's not as severe as it might be to other people. It doesn't burn as badly as when you hear an officer being accused of sexual harassment. So, you know, and if it's something that an officer does know, will follow him in his jacket. You know, there's a lot more personality behind some of the ways that people will respond to certain complaints and allegations, and I just want to be very clear that we're thinking about things with a lens that can be stretched across all of the issues that may come up. So I agree that people should not be.
Well, it's obvious we have to do more work on this. So I think a meeting would be good. Find out, you know, what the sheriff's temperature is for working with this committee or not, or this citizens review panel, and sort of all work together on something, that a product that we can turn out that's going to be helpful and that's going to, in the end, do what it's intended to do. So that's my suggestion. We can meet. I know, Sheriff, would you be interested in meeting with Elena, myself, and Tistria as well?
Absolutely. I would just again ask that the other department heads are involved as well, or at least invited. You know, we just had a meeting this morning with the lead program manager. It's law enforcement assistant diversion, and also the civilian portion of that is let everyone advance with dignity. You know, we're trying to implement that. That's going to be taking up a lot of our time. It's very important to us as well as it is to other department heads throughout the county. But we'll always make time to help wherever we can.
So we could meet down at the sheriff's office, and you could bring in whatever department heads you want, and we can have a conversation and then bring that back to the committee.
Sure, Elena, we can work together on that, and we can set up a date and time for everyone that's going to be convenient for everyone's schedule, and be happy to entertain and have some coffee. And
all right, we can do that. Elena, you got to jump off. Go ahead.
I know. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
And Rob, I think it's important too. I'll email you and me and the chairman, because I think it's important to know who's currently on this committee. Because like Supervisor Mossman said, maybe it should just be citizens. Is there any wording in the plan that says it's going to be some supervisors, some this, some that, and
we'll pull it all together.
Is he open to reconfiguring what the committee looks like and all of that?
Perfect.
Because ultimately, it's his appointment capability as the chairman to appoint and create. Okay. Sounds good. Oswaldo, question for you. I'm getting some texts from members of the public. Is there any comments on the YouTube? Is there any questions on the thread of the public viewing? Or Sherry, if Oswaldo's
I tried to get on. I was having technical difficulty. I've been texting Oswaldo, so I don't know. I could not get on to the viewing of the video.
Yeah, that's actually what I'm getting. I had
so the only thing we can do then is we'll have a transcript from this. For some reason, I might have said it. I set up the video link to this, and I don't know why it's not connecting. But what I can do is just once I get the transcript, I can pop that up, and people can at least have the transcript. I'll clean up what words don't make any sense and whatever, but it'll be the official transcript from the meeting.
What about the recording of this Google Meets? Could we just post that? Oswaldo?
That's a question for us.
Okay.
So would you be able to figure out how to repost this, Oswaldo?
Okay.
Are there any questions or comments from anyone on the live stream? So Louise, just to answer that, as an elected sheriff, there is no other model. It's very, very different in a city like Albany and Syracuse, which are the two that I know we've looked at with detail. They are appointed police chiefs. And so there is some ability for this committee to have some oversight, or if they wanted subpoena power. When it's an elected sheriff's department, we had Elena, our attorney, come in and opine on this. We cannot have investigation power. We cannot have subpoena power. So there's no example that we could find of another elected sheriff's department where there was a citizen review panel. And so we're going by what is legally allowed. And so although we have looked at cities like Albany and Syracuse, we don't have the same capability and capacity as they do. Was there any other questions, Oswaldo? Okay. And what I will say to anyone that watches this later that had a hard time getting on, because I got texts from a few people, please feel free to reach out via email, supervisor@townofnewlebanon.com, or to Rob Lagonia, and we can, answer those questions at the next meeting or email you answers. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So we'll pull this all together. We'll speak to the chairman. We'll get together with the sheriff and Elena, and then we'll get something hopefully back to the group long before our December meeting.
Yep, December 6th at 10 a.m. is the next meeting.
All right.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Good discussion. Thank you.
Take care.
Oswaldo, can you just